The F-35 fighter jet contains more than 900 pounds of rare earth elements. A Virginia-class submarine contains 9,200 pounds. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer contains 5,200 pounds. Tomahawk cruise missiles, Patriot interceptors, THAAD anti-ballistic systems, Predator drones, Joint Direct Attack munitions. Every one of these systems is built around high-performance magnets that require specific rare earth elements to function. Without them, the radar does not track. The missile does not steer. The fighter jet's engine and flight control systems do not operate. These are not components that can be substituted with something else available on short notice. They are the physical reason the weapons work. China produces and processes approximately 90% of the world's supply of these materials. Not 90% of reserves, 90% of processing. And on October 9th, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce issued what CSIS's own Critical Minerals Security Program Director called the most consequential measures China has ever taken targeting the defense sector. Starting December 1st, 2025, companies with any affiliation to foreign militaries, including those of the United States, would be largely denied export licenses for rare earth magnets and elements, not delayed, not taxed, denied. For the first time in the history of Chinese export control policy, Beijing formally applied a legal mechanism called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, a tool the United States itself invented in 1959 and has used for decades to restrict semiconductor exports to China, and turned it around, the same legal weapon, pointed back. This is not a trade story. It is not a tariff story. It is not a diplomatic negotiation story with a standard resolution waiting at the end of it. It is a story about what happens when a country discovers, over a period of years, that the weapons it relies on to project military power are built from materials it does not control, refined by processes it cannot currently replicate, and supplied by a country that has now formally decided to use that dependency as a lever. And it is a story that touches you directly, even if you have never heard of dysprosium or terbium or samarium and have no intention of ever being near a Virginia-class submarine. Here is why. The NATO stockpile analysis cited earlier, 6 to 9 months of high-intensity conflict before critical mineral reserves are exhausted, is not an abstraction. It is a statement about how long the alliance that has underwritten the security architecture most of the world operates inside since 1945 could sustain a conflict before its ability to produce the weapons it needs runs into a materials wall. If the weapons cannot be built fast enough because the supply chain is disrupted, the calculus of every conflict, every deterrence calculation, every adversary's decision about what America will or will not respond to shifts. Deterrence is not purely a function of how many weapons exist in stockpiles right now. It is a function of whether an adversary believes more can be produced fast enough that starting a conflict is not worth the risk. A supply chain that can be disrupted by licensing decisions made in Beijing changes that calculation in ways that are genuinely difficult to reverse quickly, regardless of how many billions of dollars are committed to domestic processing programs that take 5 to 7 years to mature. Stay with me? Because this story has a timeline, a mechanism, a legal architecture, and a set of consequences that are already playing out inside American defense manufacturing right now. Every number in this video comes from CSIS, the Modern War Institute, Al Jazeera, CNBC, ASPI, and peer-reviewed supply chain analysis. You are going to get the full picture, including what America is doing about it and why the honest answer to whether those responses are working is more complicated than either side of this debate wants to acknowledge. Subscribe now if the channel's commitment to that kind of sourcing matters to you, because we are going all the way down on this one. Let us start with what rare earth elements actually are, and why the dependency became this deep before anyone in Washington treated it as the emergency it now clearly is. The 17 elements grouped under the rare earth label are not, despite the name, particularly rare in geological terms. They exist in meaningful concentrations across dozens of countries, including the United States, Australia, Canada, and Brazil. The rare part of the name refers to the historical difficulty of finding them concentrated enough to mine economically. A difficulty that has largely been overcome by modern mining techniques, meaning the resource itself is not the strategic choke point. The choke point is what comes after mining. Separating rare earth elements from ore, refining them to the purity levels industrial and defense applications require, and then processing them into the high-performance permanent magnets that go inside an F-35 or Patriot interceptor involves a complex, capital-intensive, multi-stage chemical and metallurgical process that took China decades to develop and dominate. China now controls approximately 90% of global rare earth, refining and chemical separation capacity. For the heaviest and most militarily critical rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, which are essential for magnets operating at high temperatures inside jet engines and missile guidance systems, China's share of global separation capacity is closer to 99%. These are not numbers with a quick workaround. The dependency did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. And understanding how it was built is the only way to understand what it would actually take to unwind it. China's deliberate government-directed push to dominate rare earth processing began in the 1980s and was made explicit by Deng Xiaoping himself in 1992, when he said, in a statement that has been quoted so many times since that it has become almost a cliche but has lost none of its operational accuracy, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." The strategy was straightforward and executed over multiple decades without meaningful interruption. State subsidies drove production costs below what competitors elsewhere could match. Environmental regulations for rare earth extraction and processing were applied more leniently than in other countries, keeping costs lower still. Investment in the technical expertise for chemical separation, the specific bottleneck that limits everyone else's ability to replicate the supply chain, was treated as a national strategic priority rather than a commercial bet. By the time American defense planners began seriously examining the implications of this consolidation in the early 2010s, China already had a 20-year head start in the infrastructure, workforce expertise, and industrial scale that the supply chain required. The first serious warning shot came in 2010 when China temporarily restricted rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands. The price of rare earth elements spiked dramatically on global markets. Japan, South Korea, and other technology-dependent economies scrambled to find alternatives, fund new mining projects, and pressure China diplomatically. The crisis passed, prices normalized. The underlying dependency remained unchanged. The American defense establishment filed reports. Studies were commissioned. Strategies were proposed. The dependency continued. But rare earths are not the only material in this story. That is the part that almost every coverage of the October 2025 restrictions leaves out. Before China moved on rare earths, it moved on gallium and germanium. In August 2023, China imposed export restrictions on both materials with minimal international attention. Gallium and germanium are not household names. They are, however, foundational to infrared optics, radar systems, night vision equipment, and the compound semiconductors used in military communications and electronic warfare. China produces approximately 80% of the world's gallium and 60% of its germanium. The 2023 restrictions were not lifted. They were followed by restrictions on graphite, critical for battery anodes in the EVs and energy storage systems American logistics increasingly depend on. Then antimony, used in ammunition propellants and night vision equipment. Then the rare earths, each restriction built on the last. Establishing the legal architecture and the administrative infrastructure, China would need to tighten control further, while simultaneously demonstrating to Washington that each individual step was survivable enough to avoid triggering the kind of unified response that might actually change the supply chain. Gallium prices increased by approximately 50% in the months following the August 2023 restrictions. American companies scrambled to stockpile. The Department of Commerce flagged the restrictions as a serious concern. Congress held hearings. No emergency domestic production program was launched. By the time rare earth restrictions arrived in April 2025, the American response playbook had already been written: concern, stockpiling, diplomatic complaint, and continued dependency. And China had already observed what that playbook looked like from the inside. In 2019, the United States imported 80% of its rare earth materials directly from China or from countries like Estonia and Japan that refine Chinese ore into finished products before exporting to the U.S. In 2023, according to the Observatory of Economic Complexity, the United States was the world's largest importer of Chinese rare earth metals and products, importing $22, $8 million worth in that year alone. The country that had identified this as a strategic vulnerability in 2011 was more dependent on the identified threat in 2023 than it had been when the vulnerability was first formally named. This is the background against which what happened in April 2025 needs to be understood. When President Trump imposed new tariffs on Chinese goods in the first weeks of his administration, China's Ministry of Commerce responded on April 4, 2025, with export restrictions on 7 specific rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium. The specific elements chosen were not random. Terbium and dysprosium are essential for the high temperature performance of neodymium iron boron magnets, the magnets inside virtually every advanced military system. Samarium is the primary component of samarium cobalt magnets, which are used specifically in defense applications, requiring performance at extreme temperatures and in the presence of strong radiation, conditions where civilian alternatives degrade or fail. Gadolinium is used in radar systems and nuclear applications. The restriction list reads like a shopping list assembled specifically to maximize leverage over defense manufacturing rather than civilian consumer goods. Between April and October 2025, temporary diplomatic arrangements briefly restored partial access, But the stability was illusory. During the May to August tariff truce that followed negotiations in Switzerland, China's rare earth licensing system continued to disrupt American manufacturers through administrative delays, issuing licenses slowly in limited quantities to individual companies case by case, even while Beijing maintained that it had not formally abandoned the agreement. American manufacturers began shutting down production lines, not because exports were technically banned, but because the approvals that made legal exports possible were simply not being issued in the volume or on the timeline that supply chains required. The lever did not need to be pulled to full force to demonstrate its existence. The partial application was sufficient to show what full application would mean. Then came October 9th, MOFCOM announcement number 61. In a single announcement, China added 5 more rare earth elements to the restriction list: holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, and ytterbium, bringing the total to 12 of the 17 rare earth elements. It applied export restrictions to rare earth magnet manufacturing equipment, meaning that countries attempting to build their own rare earth processing industries could not simply import the specialized refining technology needed to do so, and it deployed the foreign direct product rule against American defense-affiliated companies for the first time in history. The FDPR means that even products manufactured entirely outside China can be subject to Chinese export controls if they contain Chinese origin rare earth content, regardless of how many hands they passed through between a Chinese refinery and an American defense factory. CSIS's director of the Critical Mineral Security Program, Gracelyn Bhaskaran, called it China's most consequential measures to date targeting the defense sector. The Modern War Institute at West Point published an analysis in July 2025 describing it directly. Without rare earth elements, many advanced defense systems simply do not work. The specific defense systems named in CSIS's own analysis include the F-35 fighter jet, Virginia-class, and Columbia-class submarines, Tomahawk cruise missiles, Patriot interceptors, THAAD, Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, and Joint Direct Attack munitions. These are not niche systems. They are the core of American conventional military capability, and they all contain components whose manufacturing depends on materials that, as of December 1st, 2025, China has formally decided it can withhold from companies with any affiliation to the American military, which, given the degree to which America's defense industrial base is integrated and contractor connected, covers most of the companies involved in making them. There is a second number sitting alongside the rare earth dependency that makes the situation considerably more acute than it would otherwise be. And it comes directly from CSIS's analysis published in October 2025. China is expanding its munitions production capacity and acquiring advanced weapons platforms and equipment at a pace 5 to 6 times faster than the United States. Not 5 to 6% faster, 5 to 6 times faster. While China operates with what CSIS describes as a wartime mindset, committing capital, industrial capacity, and national coordination to weapons manufacturing at a rate the United States has not matched since the Second World War. The American defense industrial base operates under peacetime conditions, with production lines calibrated to peacetime demand, trained workforce numbers appropriate for peacetime throughput, and supply chains optimized for cost efficiency rather than surge capacity. A supply chain disruption in rare earth elements lands on an industrial base that was already struggling to scale up production to meet rising demand before the restrictions existed. The restrictions do not create a production problem. They land on top of one that was already there. Here is where the story took its most unexpected turn, and the turn is important because it changes how you should read everything that came after. On October 30th, 2025, at the APEC summit in Busan, South Korea, President Trump and President Xi met for the first time since 2019. The meeting produced what analysts have since described as a mutual stand-down. China agreed to suspend the October 9th measures for 1 year, until November 2026, while the United States agreed to suspend a parallel set of restrictions on its own side. The October measures are currently paused. The April restrictions on 7 elements remain in force. The licensing architecture that allows China to modulate access administratively, issuing and withholding approvals without technically violating any agreement, remains fully intact. The legal mechanism is suspended. The capability to use it is not. ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, published an analysis in March 2026 that made the operational implication explicit. During the US-Iran conflict, China's export controls on rare earth magnets became a quiet bargaining chip in back channels. Beijing did not need to formally reinstate the October restrictions. It needed only to manage the pace of license approvals for the specific elements used in Patriot and THAAD interceptors, the missiles being consumed rapidly against Iranian ballistic attacks, to remind Washington that its military endurance in a sustained conflict is constrained by a supply chain it does not control, The analysis, published by Umair Gori, an associate professor specializing in international trade and export controls, stated the conclusion directly. China controls 90% of the rare earth supply chain and holds a critical lever over American militarism. It does not need to exercise that lever publicly. Administrative processes are sufficient. This is the moment to be fair about what America is actually doing in response, because the response is real even if it is not yet sufficient, and accuracy requires acknowledging both. The Department of Defense entered into an unprecedented direct deal with MP Materials, the company that owns the Mountain Pass mine in California, America's only active rare earth mine. The deal includes a government equity stake, guaranteed price floors for neodymium praseodymium oxide at $110 per kilogram, and an offtake agreement ensuring a government buyer for whatever the mine produces. In January 2025, before the October crisis, USA Rare Earths produced its first sample of dysprosium oxide purified to 99, 1% using ore from the Round Top deposit in Texas. The Forge Coalition, a 54-nation alliance launched in February 2026 specifically to create a preferential trade zone for critical minerals, is chaired by South Korea and includes coordinated price floors designed to make non-Chinese rare earth production economically viable without permanent subsidy. Project Vault, a $10 billion public-private initiative backed by a $12 billion total commitment, is building a strategic critical minerals reserve modeled on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths, the largest rare earth producer outside China, is expanding its U.S. processing capacity with American government funding. All of this is genuine. All of it represents real capital and real political will directed at a real problem that went unaddressed for 30 years. And all of it runs into the same constraint that every serious analyst studying this question has independently identified: time. CSIS estimates 5 to 7 years to build meaningful alternative rare earth processing capacity outside China. The Anderson Institute's analysis of the economic research on this question, drawing on work published in peer-reviewed journals, found that switching costs for critical mineral suppliers run into billions of dollars per firm, with decoupling simulations projecting first-year operating profit losses of 15 to 50%. NATO defense stockpiles, according to the same analysis, currently cover only 6 to 9 months of high-intensity conflict. A mine-to-magnet supply chain independent of China, running at the scale the American defense industrial base requires, is not a 5-year project under the most optimistic assumptions. The Mountain Pass mine can extract rare earth ore. The ore currently gets shipped to China for refining because the domestic separation capacity required to process it does not yet exist at commercial scale inside the United States. USA Rare Earths produced its first dysprosium sample in a research facility in Colorado. Producing a sample in a laboratory and producing the tonnage an F-35 production line requires are separated by years of investment permitting construction and operational ramp-up. There's one more dimension to this story that almost no coverage of the rare earth crisis has examined closely, and it is the one that arguably tells you the most about where this ends up. The October 2025 restriction on rare earth separation and processing technology exports is the piece of MOFCOM announcement No. 61 that receives the least attention and carries the most long-term strategic weight. Every country that is currently attempting to build rare earth processing capacity outside China, Australia, the United States, Canada, Japan, faces the same fundamental challenge. The specific equipment and the specific operational knowledge required to run a rare earth separation facility at scale is disproportionately concentrated in Chinese companies and Chinese institutions. By restricting the export of that equipment along with the materials themselves, China is not simply limiting current supply. It is limiting the ability of competitors to build the alternative supply they would need to eliminate the dependency. A country that can buy ore but cannot buy the machines to process it, and cannot easily hire people who know how those machines work because that expertise concentrated in one place through 3 decades of deliberately subsidized investment, faces a structural problem that diplomatic pressure and investment capital alone cannot quickly resolve. The Alfaro et al. 2025 study cited in the Anderson Institute analysis found that China's 2010 restriction triggered a surge in global rare earth patenting and expanded downstream production, but innovation did not close the gap quickly. The gap exists precisely because the problem of replicating a complex industrial ecosystem from outside is harder than the problem of building that ecosystem in the first place, and China had 3 decades of uninterrupted head start. Subscribe right now if you want this channel to track exactly what happens in November 2026 when the October suspension expires, whether China reinstates the most severe restrictions, extends the pause, or uses the decision as leverage in whatever trade and military negotiation is current at that moment. Because the November 2026 date is a deadline that is already factored into American defense planning, and what Beijing decides to do with it will be one of the most consequential materials policy decisions in the history of the U.S.-China rivalry. The November 2026 deadline is worth understanding specifically because it is not a neutral calendar date. It arrives at a moment when the American domestic rare earth response, the MP materials deal, Project Vault, the Forge Coalition, the Australian partnerships, will have been running for approximately 12 to 18 months from the point of serious capital commitment. That is not long enough to have built meaningful processing capacity. It is long enough to have demonstrated, to Beijing's own analysts, whether the American political will to fund and sustain these programs at the required scale is real, or whether it is the same pattern that played out after 2011. A crisis, a response, and then a gradual drift back to dependency once the immediate pressure eased. If China's assessment is that the American response is genuinely credible and building real capacity, the strategic calculation around reinstating the restrictions shifts. If China's assessment is that the response is slower and weaker than announced, the calculation shifts the other way. Beijing has been watching this supply chain for 30 years. Its analysts understand what a genuine mine-to-magnet build-out requires in terms of capital, permitting, construction, and workforce development, because China built exactly that at national scale over the past 3 decades. The November 2026 decision will reflect that assessment in the most concrete possible way, regardless of what any press release or diplomatic communique says about the state of the relationship. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want it to be precise enough that it has a real answer. The United States identified this rare earth dependency as a strategic vulnerability in government reports as far back as 2011, formally named China's dominance as a risk, commissioned strategies to address it, and continued to deepen the dependency for the following 14 years rather than fixing it. Given that 14-year track record, do you think the current wave of investment, the MP materials deal, Project Vault, Forge, the Australian partnerships, represents the policy response that finally closes the gap? Or is this the 3rd or 4th time America has identified this vulnerability, directed capital at it, and ultimately not followed through at the scale and duration required, leaving the problem fundamentally unchanged for the next administration to inherit? Drop your precise answer in the comments, because people who work in defense supply chains, in rare earth mining, and in materials policy have very different views on this question from people watching from the outside, and both of those views are worth reading.